In virtually every nation and on every continent, Christians are worshiping every Sunday in a variety of settings.
Lord, have mercy.
Every Sunday morning is a weekly reminder of Christ's resurrection from the dead. Belief in Jesus and His resurrection from the dead is the core of Christianity. But is this based on true history?
Christianity really is based in history, and the Apostle Paul makes that claim in 1 Corinthians 15. And he points out that if we can't rely on the historical truthfulness of the accounts, then our faith is really in vain.
And the history of the Jesus movement even goes beyond the New Testament.
Jesus was a very talked about figure in antiquity. People appealed to Him, prayed to Him, invoked His name for healing, for protection against evil spirits, for protection against just plain bad luck or injury. Jesus is much talked about in rabbinic texts, in the Quran, people don't know that, and in various magical texts and so on. And so I wanted to bring together in one book, between two covers, everything that talks about Jesus in antiquity. So that's why the book is called Jesus in the Manuscripts, not just New Testament or biblical manuscripts, but everything from antiquity, so people can see it and compare it and learn just how rich this ancient textual tradition is.
If Jesus is not resurrected from the dead, then we don't have Christianity. If you want to have a set of religious truths, there's plenty of ways to do that. And there are good teachings in the New Testament. But if we want to really think about the basis of Christianity, Christianity rests on the historical proclamation that Jesus rose from the dead. So if you separate out and say that the historical basis is not important, I would argue you don't have Christianity.
Some modern critics of the resurrection try to weasel out of it by saying He rose spiritually, but not bodily.
It's important to know that when the New Testament proclaims the resurrection of Jesus, it's a bodily resurrection. Because resurrection doesn't make any sense if the body is still in the tomb. Then it's something else. It's a ghost story. It's a vision. It's seeing an apparition of Jesus or something like that. If His body is still in the tomb, and by the way, His family and friends would know that. Jewish people were very sensitive about burial. They didn't lose track of where a loved one was placed. Jesus died the death of a criminal. His body is therefore placed in a tomb that the Sanhedrin provides. That's Jewish law. It's in writing.
When it comes to the resurrection, we of course have the most important phenomenon in the history of the world. It's clear that either Jesus rose physically, really, or not. Can the resurrection be proven? The character transformation of the apostles, it's a wonderful proof in and of itself. The change of the day of worship by the early church from Saturday to Sunday. I mean, what's more important than the Jewish Sabbath? And yet they're going to change the name. Two phenomena happened on Easter Sunday morning. Everybody overlooks the other phenomenon, which can be proven. And that is the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea, into which Jesus was buried on Friday, was in fact empty on the morning of the resurrection.
A fascinating aspect of the resurrection of Jesus is the way it has converted some skeptics.
The original skeptics of the resurrection were the apostles. They weren't convinced. And when Jesus shows up in Luke 24, they weren't convinced. And it wasn't until He began teaching them, reminding them of what He taught them, and how His resurrection as well as His death brought to completion what the Hebrew Bible, what the Old Testament had been teaching, and what He had been teaching them.
Paul also says in one of his letters that, of course, Jesus appeared to the disciples, even appeared to Himself. So we actually have firsthand evidence from somebody who saw Jesus, who, by the way, was a hostile witness. Paul was not a follower of Jesus, but a critic and a persecutor of the church. And Paul even talks about Jesus appearing to more than 500 people at one time. In my view, that rules out the possibility of hallucinations or wishful thinking, but the resurrection is real, and a whole lot of people saw Jesus, experienced it, and that's why they were willing, more than willing, to proclaim his resurrection, even if it meant their own death.
But skeptics converted by the risen Jesus wasn't just a first century phenomenon. J. Warner Wallace is by trade a cold case homicide detective and a former skeptic.
I knew, for me, as a 35-year-old who was not a Christian, that central claim is this guy, did this guy rise from the grave? I didn't have to worry about it. I didn't investigate anything else. I just focused on that claim. And that claim changes everything. Now, there's evidence related to the empty tomb of Jesus, the resurrection. You have an empty tomb. If it wasn't empty, this would be over in the first century. You have people who refuse to recant their stories. If they had recanted their stories, this would be over with in the first century.
Another former skeptic, convinced by the resurrection, among other things, is Lee Strobel, former legal affairs editor for the Chicago Tribune.
When you consider most of what we know from ancient history is from one or two sources, but 9 ancient sources inside and outside the New Testament, that is a convincing amount of evidence that convinced me that the disciples encountered the resurrected Jesus. It changed their lives. It changed everything about them. They were willing to die for. We have 7 ancient sources inside and outside the New Testament that say that the disciples were willing to suffer lives of deprivation and suffering as a result of their proclamation.
Scholars note that one of the major aspects of the resurrection of Jesus is that it was such a pivotal moment in the history of the world.
The resurrection of Jesus Christ was the turning point in human history. I mean, it is the miracle of miracles, and it's really the basis for our understanding that God accepted the sacrifice of His Son. Romans 4 says that the resurrection is tied into our justification. If Christ had not been raised, then there's no guarantee that God could declare us righteous. It was the event that set in motion our future resurrection. So it really has changed everything.
My read is the resurrection happened. That is indeed the best explanation for the proclamation of these people. Jesus has died. Oh no, wait, He's alive. He hasn't failed after all. He really is living. And that's why the message took hold and swept the Roman Empire in 300 years. There's nothing like that in history.
I believe Jesus rose bodily from the dead as He predicted, because the historical evidence strongly suggests this. What's a fascinating thing to observe is that we have no less than 11 sources, ancient sources, that tell us that the disciples of Jesus were willing to suffer continuously and willing to suffer to the point of dying. Now, we know that several of them were martyred because we have multiple early independent sources that attest to this.
During these days of COVID, we see an increase in suffering and death. Scholars note that in Christ's resurrection, death is conquered.
As we try to cope with our suffering and even the death that we face, the resurrection is really the answer to that. It is the guarantee. Jesus' resurrection is the guarantee that we will one day be raised, that we will have new bodies, that the pain, that the suffering that we face in this current life will be finished.
The reality of the resurrection of Jesus is, you might say, the ultimate game changer. Because when you think about the world today, people who suffer, people who are ill, people who die, how the depressing time we've been through with COVID and all the rest of this, the resurrection of Jesus gives us hope. Ultimately, it shows God cares. God is with us. There is the hope of new life. There is the hope of conquering illness and death. So the resurrection message is as relevant today as ever. It's as important for us today as it was for Jesus' followers 2,000 years ago.